Hi folks, I'm International Master John Watson, and this is Ask the Master on ICC TV. The main idea of this show is to provide you, the listeners and viewers, with a forum to ask questions about chess and the world of chess. The best way to ask questions actually is to send them to me in advance so I can consider them during the week, and that's at the email askimwatson@chessclub.com. That's ASKIMWATSON at chessclub.com, and I'll consider those emails, and I'll try to get to all of them actually. You can also send me a game that way. You don't have to send me questions necessarily. You can send me comments about the world of chess, and I can talk about them, or opinions. Your own games. Quite a few people send me their own games. In fact, I'm going to try and get to a couple more of those today. The alternative is to ask a question right now live at the chat on your right on YouTube, and I see that there's some people on there already. The other thing you can do is you can send to my if you're an ICC member, Internet Chess Club member, you can send to my ICC handle. You can message me at John L. Watson. So you message space JOHNLWATSON. So I do want to mention that if I don't get to your question, I guess people don't always realize this. If I don't get to your question on the chat or by email, either way, but in the first week that you send it to me, there's a decent chance that I'll get to it later. I get to a majority of questions that I get, both by email and on the chat. Now, I'm not always going to get to them. Sometimes they're not easy to answer or quite relevant, or also sometimes there's just not time. But if you watch the next few shows, there's a good chance that I'll answer something that I didn't get to this week. What else? Well, of course, there's a question of what to ask about and talk about. We talk a lot about openings. People love to ask opening questions, and I have some expertise in that since I've played them and taught them for many, many years. There's chess strategy, there's chess books and chess videos, and really anything that you want to talk about. Players. In fact, I got a very interesting question that I thought I'd start out with. The other thing you can do is you can comment below the YouTube broadcast. Those of you who are watching this later on YouTube, you can put comments below the broadcast, and hopefully I'll notice those before the next week. And that's for those of you who aren't ICC members and don't feel like emailing. What else? I think that's about it. So let me take a look at the chat, and then I've got some things to talk about. I got a funny question just today. Here we go. They're scrolling up. Okay, there's Alan, Colin. Give your opinion on the Najdorf A3 as played by Carlsen Karyakin. Is the point that A6 is kind of slow, so white can afford a slow move in return? Thanks. Yeah, I haven't studied it carefully. I might as well start with that, and then we'll go into some of the questions that I've just gotten. Hi, everybody. Okay, let me do that. I'm not a Najdorf expert at all, especially, well, I know some of the old lines, but and I do teach the Najdorf sometimes, so I know some lines, but A3 is new to me, and I'm not really sure about it. I would say A6 is not that slow a move. It kind of has the threat of playing E5 without allowing knight B5, and it's pretty fast. B5 and bishop B7, threatening B4, winning the pawn, is fairly quick, and that's one of the Najdorf's pretty dynamic, so I don't think that it's slow. I think it's one of those all-purpose moves. The idea is that you're going to play it anyway in so many lines where black plays B5 because it stops B4. So it's a move you're going to play anyway, and it's just designed to give you a lot of flexibility. I wish I had gone back. I mean, maybe next week I'll do this. Maybe I'll go back and look at those games by Carlsen and Karyakin and see what specific point in terms of move order it had in that game. I think it's basically a move order issue. Sort of, they want to play lines with the A3 anyway, but they're going to adjust depending how black plays it. I would think, for example, that a Scheveningen line like this would make A3 look a little funny if you were a Scheveningen player. I mean, maybe A3 isn't all that useful. I notice it hasn't really caught on since they've played it, at least as far as I can make out. I'll check it. I'll check the statistics next week and see how many people are playing it. If you play, yeah, okay. So I guess I don't have much more to say about that. Sometimes when there's an e5 and a d5 kind of thing, that would stop bishop b4. I can see that as being a bit of a point. I don't really think it's because a6 is slow. I think it's more that you want to see what black's doing. You want black to commit, and if that makes any sense. But I don't. This is not a great answer because I'm not really used to the ideas. So sorry about that. Now let me see. Did you ever play Bobby Fischer? No, I never did. He came to visit a tournament that I was in and stared at my game from behind the chair. That's about as close as I got to Bobby Fischer. Okay, a4. Someone's talking about a4 here. Okay. All right. Let me see. Oh, okay. So I got some interesting general questions. You know, usually we do chess questions that are specifically about moves and games, but I got two questions that are sort of more general. So maybe we'll do more talking this time. Who is the most underrated player in history? I got that today. So I had to think about it a little bit. I'm not sure. And two players that come to mind, and you might want to throw some more onto the chat, but I think the main reason the two that I'm thinking of are underrated is because they didn't play matches for the World Championship, but they were absolutely world-class players. The first is Giza Moroxi, and what I'm doing, I used Jeff Sonus's historical ratings, which you can find at the site chessmetrics.com. Unfortunately, he hasn't kept it up. I think it goes through 2004 or something like that. But it has all these historical ratings. What he's done is he's done a sort of with an algorithm, he's tried to estimate what the ratings were going all the way back to the 19th century. And he does that by taking tournament cross tables. So he does regular calculations, but he sort of adjusts them to adjust for the fact of, make them sort of equivalent to modern ratings is the idea for each little era. So it's not really biased for the fact that ratings have been inflated recently. That's at least sort of the general idea. Anyway, it's incredibly fascinating. I'm sure it's not perfect, but it gives you a really good idea about who was good and who wasn't and what their relative strengths were. Anyway, when you look at chessmetrics.com, you can see Moroxi was in the mid-2700s for a whole decade before he peaked, and he peaked in about 1904 to 1906, but he'd already been a strong player for quite a while. And then he went over 2,800 for 2.5 years. He was actually ranked #1 in the world for almost 3 years. Well, actually 3 years, from 1904 to 1907. Now he's ranked #1. Now, obviously, Emanuel Lasker was the strongest player in the world. I think nobody would argue with that. But really, you could argue he was the second best. And Lasker just happened to slip during that period. He didn't play that much, and for some reason, he slipped down to, he must have had one mediocre result, and he slipped down to as low as 8 before regaining #1 again. But the only person who broke his #1 streak, a very lengthy #1 streak, was Moroxi, in fact. Now, some more statistics from that site. I think it's really interesting. Moroxi had the 11th highest one-year peak average rating, meaning that if you take all the players in history for their average rating for 1 year, see, he takes the ratings for every month, actually. It's an amazing site. And if you average those and take the peak average rating that Moroxi ever had, he's number 11. He's also the 11th highest 2-peak average rating and 3-year peak average rating. But what was really amazing was that for an impressively long time, he was very strong, and he had the 14th highest average rating of all time, of all players, for a 10-year period, which is really quite amazing since there have been all these world champions and all these other people. So at the end of this spectacular period, Moroxi was 42 years old, and World War I sort of got in the way. And in fact, he played very little starting in 1910, and almost, I think, not at all from 1914 to 1919. So obviously that had to do with World War I. And then he comes back in 1920 at age 50. I find all this fascinating. I hope I'm not boring everybody, but he spends 15 years between ages 50 and 64, rated at somewhere between number 8 and number 15 in the world. I mean, there's an exception of like 1 month or something. And I just think that's an incredible career, because longevity is sort of part of being a great player, and he certainly had that. The second player I looked at, hi Jim, wow, we've got Jim Tarjan on. Speaking of longevity, Jim's playing one of the top senior players in the world, certainly in the United States. Are you #1, Jim, in the United States for your age? I think it's possible. Certainly he's the most active player of his age. And the other guy I was going to mention was Sammy Reshevsky. who also I think is a little underrated, even though he's more famous than Maroczy. Referring to Sonus's historical ratings again, we find that Reshevsky was in the top 10 for no less than 24 years. He ended the year ranked first in the world twice and second in the world in 3 years, and was the third highest rank in the world in 11 different years. And he held fourth place in the world 5 times. So this is just absolutely amazing, elite stuff, much better than many world champions. And this was mainly in competition with top players because he didn't play that much. So he wasn't just knocking off amateurs or something to get his rating. These were the top players. In the second half of the 1930s alone, listen to some of these results. He took clear first in Margate, 1935, ahead of, for example, Capablanca. He won very strong U.S. championships in 1936 and 1938, and of course many later. He finished equal third in the famous Nottingham 1936 tournament. He shared first place at Cameri in 1937, another super tournament, and he won Hastings 1937-38. Reshevsky remained one of the world's elite throughout the 1940s and much of the 1950s. For example, he tied for second through fourth in the famous 1953 Zurich International World Championship qualifier. And in the U.S. versus USSR match of 1955, Reshevsky on board won his 4-game mini-match versus Botvinnik, 2.5 to 1.5. He's the only American that won his match. The rest of the U.S. team scored 4.5-23.5. Just a miserable, miserable result. Anyway, Reshevsky closed out his career at an incredible level. He qualified for the 1964 Amsterdam Interzonal at age 52. At age 55, he won 6th through 8th place in the Seuss Interzonal, thus earning a spot in the candidates. He qualified and played in 2 more interzonals, including Porterou's 1973 at the age of 61. He was still a strong player going into the 1980s, and just 4 months before reaching age 70, he achieved a 3-way tie for first place in the 1981 U.S. Championship, which was a zonal tournament, and even in the playoff he tied, but lost on tie breaks. Reshevsky spent 13 years at 27 or above in Sonus's historical ratings, and he was over 2,600 for 40 years. I think he's really underrated. I thought you just don't hear as much about his career as you do from equivalent players who really have much less impressive careers. Okay, so let me just see here. Okay, I've got a bunch of questions. Let's see what I got on the chat for a second. Hey, there's Elliot Winslow. Thanks for coming on. We've got some celebrities on today. How many chess players in 1904? Oh, a lot, actually. You'd be surprised. I mean, there's quite a row of great players, and you can look at historical. #1 old geezer in the USA. That's what I thought. Yeah. Jim's playing a lot, and he is a legend, but he's also a currently active legend, right? So do you have any opinions on the following line? Okay, so before I get to the next question, let's take a look at Colin's question. E4, E5. Let me just look ahead here. It's a Petrov's with bishop d3, rook e1, c3, f5. Oh boy. Or Petrov's with early f5 in general. That's what Korchnoi and people like that were playing many years ago. I get the impression, sorry, Petrov's. This is Petrov's here, this move. And this is the main line here. And we talked about this move knight c3, which is so popular right now. And we've also talked about, I've talked about this move before, which I think is underrated. Speaking of underrated, we even talked about queen e2, if I remember right. Oh, I'm sorry, we talked about taking here and queen e2 and queen e7 and this nonsense. But it's kind of fun. But this is the main line. This is the traditional main line. He's asking about where you play just d4 at this point. And d5 and bishop d3. Okay, knight c6. And castles, bishop e7, rook e1, and bishop g4. Yeah, bishop g4, c3, f5. Yeah, isn't this Karpov, Korchnoi? I think that they played f5 at this point. And there's always this thing about where white goes over here and takes one of these pawns. And then black is a pawn down but has things where he takes and plays bishop h4 and hits f2. And it's all real crazy. Now, all I remember is that players seem to have stopped playing this at some point. And I almost never see this line anymore. And I think it's because basically a lot of it's pretty forcing. And in the end, white was getting the better game out of a lot of it. So at the very top, I think black couldn't figure out how to deviate. And that's about all. I mean, if I tried to go into specifics, I can look it up for next week. I wouldn't possibly remember any specifics, but I do remember that sometimes white just grabs one of these pawns, or maybe wins this one, and that black tries to attack but doesn't really get enough for it. Anybody else who knows about this might as well can throw in their opinion about it, by the way. Someone who plays either e4 as white and plays this main line against the Petrovs, which I don't, or knows the Petrovs from the black period. Yeah, we have a question about asking people playing. Yeah, that's a lengthy. Jim didn't play for, it's 30 years. That's an amazing amount of time. Okay, that's the chat. Let me get to this other question that we had last week that I think is also very interesting and not specific to moves as much as it is to, give me a second. By the way, I have a correction. I said that the book Chess for Hawks, this is last week by Cyrus Lakdawala, was from Everyman Publishing, but it's actually from New in Chess. Cyrus does most of his books for Everyman Publishing, so I just sort of assumed that. But it's actually by New in Chess. Now, from the chat last week, we had an interesting question that John Thomas asked. Do you know a book that discusses chess style in detail? And so we mentioned a few books. Both you, the listeners, and I mentioned some books. But John Harbin mentioned Lars Bo Hansen's book on types of players, and he couldn't remember the title offhand, and I certainly couldn't. But I looked it up. It's called Foundations of Chess Strategy: Applying Business Methods to Chess Preparation and Training. It's by Gambit Books, and it was written in 2005. And of course, for things like chess strategy and styles of players, historical styles especially, it doesn't really matter what year the book was written. It doesn't really have to be up to date. So I should say right away that I really like this book a lot, but the part about the business methods isn't really very relevant, and I thought it was kind of unconvincing. It's kind of just a handle for the book to get, I don't know. It's just to me, it's just a theme that doesn't even really apply very much, and that's okay because as the book proceeds, it has less and less to do with the book anyway, and the chess content is the point, and it's really superb. And it is interesting about styles. Here's a few comments that have to do with player styles that I made in my review, my book review of it. It said the largest section and longest chapters of the book have to do with separating world champions and other great players into classifications or types of players. These classifications are meant to reveal fundamental inclinations and practices revealed even in their annotations. Hansen, and he uses many examples. So if you wanted a book on styles of players, this is a good start. And it's also a good book. It's a good teaching book. So I think it's worth thinking about. Once again, it's called Foundations of Chess Strategy, and it's Lars Bo Hansen. Anyway, here are the categories. Activists, who are attackers, great tacticians, bold sacrificers. They often take risks and employ almost irrationally aggressive and enterprising methods. Hansen classifies Tal, Anand, Shirov, and Morozevich as attackers. Their main weakness should be pretty obvious, that they are willing to take positions in which they may stand worse and that their risky play may simply backfire against them. Then there's what he calls pragmatics, which probably pragmatists is a better word, who are calculators and fact-based players. They tend to be very theoretical in the opening, which often goes with sharp attacks. They are, as their name suggests, practical and not irrational. Hansen includes Lasker, Elyekin, Oiva, Spassky, Fischer, Kasparov, and Korchnoi in this group. They can play weakly in dull positions, he thinks. Theorists are the next group. They have a large base of theoretical knowledge relating to factors such as pawn weaknesses, maneuvering in closed positions, and use of two bishops, etc. They tend to be followers of the history of the game and its development. Their games are logical and systematic. They can be too dogmatic. Great theorists are Steinitz, Tarrasch, Nimzovich, Botvinnik, and Kramnik. And finally, there's reflectors, who I don't know if that's a very good term, but anyway, their players have a feel for where the pieces belong and very good understanding of piece coordination. Reflectors are good at exploiting small advantages and are strong in the endgame. They calculate less than those in other categories. Sometimes the reflector finds the game too easy and loses for that reason. Famous reflectors are Capablanca, Smyslov, Petrosian, Karpov, and Adams. And of course, since that book, we have Magnus Carlsen. He seems to fit into the reflector category just perfectly. So I think these categories are all interesting, and they're a lot of fun, and the book's a lot of fun. And of course, naturally, I disagree with some of them. What were some things? Well, I think all these people have universal styles, especially now, but especially when it comes to modern players, and even more so now. And as for the exact division, I don't see Petrosian, who was a notoriously great calculator, and Karpov, who was a great calculator, as fitting into the reflector category. Um, and Lasker and Spassky, excuse me, and Lasker and Spassky are pragmatic in the normal sense of the word, but they're hardly opening theorists, and they're not weak players in dull positions, so, or weaker players. Botvinnik seems like a good pragmatic. Anyway, I won't go on and on about that, but that's, I had some doubts about the specific categories. But anyway, it's a really good book. And while I was looking at that, I noticed another book. See, sorry, I'm a little disorganized here. That might answer another question that people have been asking. Let me see if I can find that. It's by another Hansen, Karsten Hansen. I keep being asked about positional books. And I wanted to mention books that might improve your positional play. And in fact, there's a book by Karsten Hansen from that same year, and that's why I happened to notice it. It's called Improve Your Positional Chess. And in my review of that book, I called it a blend of generally accepted principles and more sophisticated concepts, all mixed with interesting opinions and interpretations. He uses exclusively middle game positions to make his points. I think that's cool. Ones that are extremely well chosen and non-standard. And finally, there's one more middle game oriented book that I sort of looked through my reviews for, and it's Vyacheslav Einhorn's book, Decision Making at the Chessboard, which is a little more difficult, maybe a little more advanced, but he looks at the development of games with a view towards their critical positions and decisions. So most of the games are his own, but he includes a number of classics to talk about, to be reanalyzed in light of their critical decisions. So that's those are some books that you might want to look into. And I'm sorry I went through those so quickly, but you might want to. You can always look at the show later and rewind and find those titles. Okay, let me go back to the chat for a second. Ah, okay. Yeah, that's. I was just telling Jim that I actually was the only time I even saw Fisher where he came to look. He was looking at my game from behind me, and that's as close as I got. That's right. He could go. Yeah. Okay. Good question. It's really good to see. C4 with the idea instead of rook e1. Okay. Yeah, you can play c4. I know they play c4 in a lot of positions, but isn't rook e1 actually what Karpov played here? I think it's an option. You can play the c3 rook e1 idea too, Elliot, but I'm not saying it's superior. You think the c4 is superior. That would go into the main line, basically. One of the very main lines is c4. I'm right about that, right? This is kind of a famous position, I believe. But so is this one, I think, at least. But now maybe this was abandoned. Maybe not the f5 idea wasn't abandoned. Maybe rook e1 was abandoned. I don't know. But it seems to me I even saw recently a game where somebody tried this f5 idea and got in trouble. So we could maybe someone else knows more about this. But Elliot could. Oh, here we go. Didn't see c4 usurp this line. Yeah, it probably did. I know c4 became the main line, but I don't know if was it c4 in that exact order. Maybe it was. Okay, maybe it's an earlier bishop g4 where they play rook e1 and c3. But all I remember is those lines with bishop h4 trying to counterattack here ended up all being better for white. But I'll take everybody's word for that. It makes sense. So c4 is kind of the move you'll see in a lot of modern games. What, is there something like this, for example? Anyway, I don't remember. Then you take it. Just don't know. I think. Oh yeah. There's some famous games of this, aren't there? Where this kind of thing happens, and then knight c3, right? Rook e1 and knight c3 and those kind of moves. Yeah. These are old. This is kind of old theory. Some of this. Okay. Could you please analyze the offbeat? Yeah, that's in our book, Taming the Wild Chess Openings, also in earlier books. Levitt used to suggest this line. It's called the Clarendon Court, which is I think a district in, or either a hotel or a district in London. So the British sort of got into this, as they got into so many weird openings. I think it's not really objectively that good, but it's kind of fun. It's fun to play. And one of the problems are these quick gambits with e4 and f3. For example, there's this idea of queen b6 as sort of a major idea. So let me see if I can remember this. I think something like knight c3 here, and maybe even just f3 right away is the safe way to do it. And what black tries to do is set up a blockade on the dark squares. You know, something like, let's just try something here, takes. And now does white have to take back is one question. I guess he's not too unhappy doing that. White might try to break something down this way too with bishop g5. And the other thing is you can sacrifice a pawn and see how that works. Could have done that last move. This position, I think, turned this out to be very difficult for black. There was an article about this in Kaiseber magazine, which was all about irregular openings. It's Stefan Bicker's magazine, which he had for years and years and years. And someone was showing how strong this idea was, and it seemed awfully convincing. I don't know. Have you looked at? There are some books and discussions about it. At least there used to be things in magazines about it. I don't know if anybody's really put it in a book, recommended it in a book. That's to say black's point of view. But seems to me those are the most dangerous lines. They're very hard to defend because white's just kind of blasting through. And the minute you play here, you've got this enormous weakness on the E file. So that's a real problem. Now naturally, white could just even here do something like this and here and try to recover that. Or I mean, there's plenty of ways to play. There's also bishop g5, just trying to sort of mess up this pawn structure here. I think you might find that almost all of these tend to favor white. I don't know about this one because here you have that protecting here and attacking here. So maybe this one's okay. Although even this I'm a little skeptical of. Maybe just here. And there are ideas of d6. And it's just I'd say it's just, to me, it's a very tough position. Just very hard to play, very suspicious for black. But, you know, you could have some fun with it. Certainly if white plays slowly, you can do things with it. For example, this Dutchy kind of line like this. I've got a feeling because of c4, which means you don't have a bishop c4 or a bishop b5 check also, that now this kind of thing isn't so bad. Maybe you play a Leningrad Dutch kind of thing. Maybe you play knight here. I think this kind of position could be kind of fun for black. Just depends if white breaks through early or can sacrifice something, but I think that one might be okay. So that's about all I know. I might look it up, and I might look that one up and see if I can caveat interviews. All right, okay. I missed something big there. Just a shame he never got the right agent. Who are we talking about here? We're not talking about Jim. Oh, Kasparov? No. Fischer. Oh, Dick Cavett. Dick Cavett, yes. The Dick Cavett interviews. Well, Dick Cavett was a really good interviewer, actually. He's a pretty amazing interviewer, actually. Sort of miss those old shows. You can still watch those old shows on, you know, the old TV. I think on YouTube even you can probably find them. Okay, hi John, I mean all of Cavett's, not just Fischer. Hi John, is Aronian the best player of the world at the moment? He won Grenke in 2 very strong tournaments. No, I guess I wouldn't say that. I think that these guys trade off winning tournaments. I'm really glad to see him back because he's a very creative player and really good guy and just an interesting player. And it was kind of sad. He's been kind of sinking a little bit and having kind of mediocre results now for what, almost 2 years. Not terrible. He's you know, an incredibly strong player, but it's good to see him at the top again. Remember, he had a little period there where he won all the tournaments, and people would have said that he was better than Anand, Topalov, and Kramnik because he did it for a couple of years. He was just winning tournament after tournament and just played tremendously. I hope he's yeah, I just wouldn't say he's the best player of the world just because, well, of course, it's Carlsen. So Carlsen's the best player in the world, you know, until proven otherwise. And he's still the highest rated, by the way. So even though he came close to losing the highest rated status. What's Aronian? 3rd now, maybe, after this tournament? 3rd or 4th? He's behind Kramnik, but I think he's probably moved ahead of Caruana, is my guess. Anyway, what are we doing here? What do you think the best games of the 210s have been so far? That's something I can't just pull out of my memory offhand, but I'll look at it for next week for sure. I meant to ask, what ideas are discouraging the Leningrad Dutch? What makes it less popular than the Classic or the Stonewall? Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. There's a couple recent repertoire, well, I think there's a video, maybe a book about the Leningrad, suggesting that people play the Leningrad. Let me show everybody what the Leningrad Dutch is. Of course, it kind of matters, move order. In fact, that might be part of the point, by the way, is that the move orders. If you play, there's a lot of Dutches where you don't have to play that. You don't have to play that immediately. You can play this first and then play for F5 later. You can play E6 first and play for F5, but then you can't play the Leningrad anymore. So one thing is you have to meet all the irregular lines. If you're intending to play the Leningrad, I think you have to play this one first. Maybe D6, but I doubt it. Or maybe the modern defense, but which means you have to be ready to play all this against all this sort of irregular stuff, and so that might be part of it right there. But let me show you what the traditional main line of the Leningrad is. The traditional main line of the Leningrad goes like this. Now white definitely doesn't have to play G3, but that's the old main line. And black plays like this. And white, if white plays C4, which is, your move. Now a lot of people were playing things like C3 for a little while. I know that was going on. And black's idea is to play for the move E5, and there are 3 traditional ways to do that, or at least just set up with the potential playing E5. And there were 3 ways in this position. Now, sometimes white delays that move and plays B3. That's an interesting possibility. But there were 3 ways for black to play in this position. One of the traditional ways was this, and it was kind of revived. It's been played quite a bit. Larson played that way, and I remember in the old days, I used to be white in all these positions, and I remember white's main idea was to go like that and try to get pressure on the E6 and C6 and stuff. And but that's been played recently, actually. Then this move was popular briefly, and it's still played once in a while. And there are 2 ways to play after this move, and one is to go here. But I think white probably is better here, but he has to know what he's doing. It's kind of a dynamic position for black because there's F4 ideas. And you can also play that way, but I don't think anybody believes in it anymore, as far as I know. So then what became super popular was this move, and that's the move I think you're referring to. We're not seeing this much anymore, and I don't know why. Or at least not as often as you did. There was a time where this was just almost automatic for black. If he was playing the Leningrad, he would play for this variation. The idea is just to play this directly. And I don't know, does anybody have any idea? I will look it up and I will try to see. I haven't followed this theory at all, but yeah, I just don't know. Maybe there was some line with rook E1, wasn't there? I mean, black always has this idea of playing here in knight E4 and attacking on F2 if you play rook E1, but I still think it was working for white. I think this move somehow was giving white some small advantage. Traditionally, this move's been very important too. For a while, black was taking and playing queen B5 to hit this and maybe tie him down a little bit. And I don't know how that theory came out. There's a point where people thought white was better there. So you'd have to look up some of these lines and see. The best thing to do in this case is go to a correspondence database and see what people are playing against these moves. That's where you'll probably find the best theory. You can also just look at Megabase and see what happens. The problem is you're not going to see any real top players like super grandmasters playing this way, I don't think. Haven't for a long time. For a while, Nakamura, I think, played the Leningrad a little bit. He's played the Dutch in various forms. And I think he played for a little while, but that was a while ago. You might want to look at those games too. But it's fascinating stuff, and I will check this for next week because I'm curious myself. I like to castle along with black, although I start with F5. Now, are we talking about in the Dutch? Oh, wait, we've got other questions here. Okay, so I won't get to my others. I've got to get quickly through with some of this so I can show you stuff from last week that I need to answer. Okay, Alan Llewellyn, how does the line Fischer played against the English 3 knights with a gambit? Did Fischer play that? I'm surprised. I know Bellin, it's called the Bellin Gambit. Bellin played it. Interesting, I didn't know Fischer played this. For a little while, a bunch of people were playing this. Oh, knight c6, knight, no, you're thinking of knight f6. I'm sure you're thinking of knight f6, because this wouldn't make any sense to play e4 here. White would just take that and laugh. So I'm sure you're talking about knight f6. And this is called the Bell and Gambit. Let me get back there. Here, here, here. Yeah, I can show you a little about this. In fact, well, it was fairly big when I was playing the English Opening as white. It's only big for a couple of years, but white should play here, attacking this twice. And the idea is that then black plays this move, diverting the pawn from the center so he can defend his center. And then the idea is that, I think, it says it involves f5 and a pawn sack on f4. Oh, we've got a whole different thing going on here. You're asking a different question. This is the Bell and Gambit. And just for the record, I think this was the demise of the Bell and Gambit. This white's just somewhat better if he declines the Gambit playing there. You are asking about knight c6, but you're not asking about e4. You're asking about f5 is what you're asking about. And you're talking about, for example, the famous Fischer-Sadie game. Although actually that was with e3 and knight e2. So I'm not even sure if this is a Fischer thing. Someone might be able to help me out here. Alan, you might be able to help me out here. E4 certainly doesn't make sense here. So this is a totally legitimate move, still played by a lot of players. It's perfectly good. And then, yes, sometimes you're going to sacrifice a pawn on this way. The more common, the thing Fischer got into against Sadie was this. It was f5 here, here. Very famous game. Totally unsound, by the way. I mean, really unsound, not even close. He played f4, I think, right away. Or did he wait one more move? He may have waited one more move. I should remember. It's been a long time. And it's that sacrifice. And it just has been, you can play this a tempo up as white, and it's not even that good. So in this position, it's particularly not good. In the Sicilian defense, in the Grand Prix attack, you can play this way. But it worked enough for that game. He won a very, very pretty game, just kind of piled up. It was something like, I don't know, something like this. And I think he went and did this whole business of coming over and attacking this way. Or at least that was the thread, and then pretty soon he just won all the squares. Notice he controls d4, and he's going to have the f file and got a pretty attack. But it's an absolutely, totally unsound attack. But Fischer had a tendency against the American players to play very loosely because I think he just thought he could crush all of them, at least the lower American players. Yes, that's the one. Okay. I believe Jim is a citizen of the United States from birth. I'm not saying most GMs are not born here. What's so difficult to understand? Okay. Okay, we're talking about foreign-born and native grandmasters. So I don't think I'll get into that discussion, but it is interesting, of course, especially after the Soviet Union fell. You just got gobs of people coming over here for chess players coming over here and grandmasters, and so it made it a very culturally very different game. And for a long time, the Olympia, our Olympic team was mostly foreign-born players, and now that's changed a lot because we have, well, Nakamura is theoretically foreign-born, but he was only in Japan a little while. He's basically American raised from a very young age, and by Americans. And who else do we have? Well, we have, what's wrong with me? Caruana was American-born, I believe, unless he was Italian-born, moved to America, and then came back. But anyway, his chess education was in America before he moved over to Italy, and now has moved back. Wesley So is definitely not. He's Philippine and has only recently moved here. Who else do we have? But all the young players, the great, strong young players like Naroditsky, Rowson, Josh Friedel, I'm missing some obvious players, I'm sure. Sam Shankland are born in the United States. So things have really changed. A lot of the top U.S. players now are, in fact, were born in the United States, most of them. So, all right, let me keep moving here. We've got from last week, oh, here's one. Jacob Surratt, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, asked, could you show a good way to fight against the line d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, e6, well, anyway, e3, f5. So I did a funny move order there, but I got to the same position. Yeah, and this might be relevant to quite a few people, especially people who played knight f3 on the first move, or play knight f3 against the Slav order, which is actually the one he asked about. Play knight f3 here instead of knight c3. Now you can avoid this by playing knight c3, and there's a related line that goes like this, and this one's not as good because white can set up two different ways here. White can set up with knight here, a bishop here, and put his knight here. And that's very handy. It means you have f3 later. There's no knight coming to e4, and it means you might get an e4 move in. Knight f4 is a handy move. And the other thing is there's a very dramatic way to play against this. I'm sorry, this is a slight side comment, but it has to do with move orders. If you play knight c3 against a Slav instead of knight f3, you don't have to deal with this. g4 is a very oddball move, but I think it's quite strong. It's been played a lot, and it's done very well. And there are books that say that, give recommendations for black, but I don't think any of them are that good. The main line, now you can decline it, but it turns out white gets good play there too. The main line is this, and the queen exerts some pressure, and white has a central, this is still a bad bishop, and there are some weak central squares. Obviously, white would like to put a knight on e5. I simply like this position for white, and I've studied it a lot. It's in my book, for one thing. But this is completely different. If you play this move first, which many people do, and they play a semi-Slav and you play here, then that's a much better move in this position. It's played by quite a few strong players, and the question is, how do I play against that? So let me. I didn't know about this result against India. Very interesting. Okay, so I'm getting distracted by the chat. Sorry, folks. Let me just say this is what I sort of wanted to say about this. Let me just show you. Okay, every time we're supposed to have one sort of instructive game. We've talked about this before, so this will be our instructive game. And let me just show you first a game that was played that went like this first: e3, bishop d6. b3 f5. So it's the same idea and could easily transpose. And then bishop e2. Of course, you could always play bishop d3, but bishop e2 is what most top players tend to play against this setup. And castles. And I think this is quite instructive. Now, there's this idea about playing bishop a3 to exchange off black's good bishop. Notice how bad that bishop is. And remember, when you're looking at good and bad bishops, you want to look at the color of the central pawns. So this is considered a good bishop because it's opposite the color of the central pawns. And this is considered a bad bishop here because it's on the same color as the central pawns. Not to mention the pawns that are right next to the center, which tends to influence whether a bishop is good or not also. So white is possibly going to play bishop there. So in this game, black stops that exchange of the good bishop for the bad bishop. Notice that white's bishop here is kind of a bad bishop. Now, it turns out we've discovered over the years that exchanging off that bishop isn't such a dire thing, and that doesn't actually hurt black as much as you'd think it would. But anyway, in this game, white plays here, which I think tends to be a better move anyway, in my opinion. And there's one game, Magnus Carlsen was black and played the move b6, and white went over to exchange this. And I think white was very, very slightly better. This is Jonathan Rowson, who was a British champion several times, versus Magnus Carlsen. And black eventually won this game, but not because of the opening. But it's a fairly even way to play for black. The whole position's okay for black. It's just white's probably a little bit better. Another move you can make is knight here. There was another game that went like this. Now that's a common theme. Someone was asking, how do you play against it? Well, one way is to put your bishop on b2 and throw a knight into there. The idea being that that's a outpost square. And if he tries to get rid of it, he either has to give up his bishop, which is really dangerous because then you get the two bishops, or he has to give up his knight, and in this case he can't even take with a knight yet because there's a fork, so white would win a piece. And so this knight on e5 tends to be pretty good, and black would like to put a knight on e4 in these Dutch positions, but in this case it can be kicked around. So that's a basic idea for white. Now that doesn't mean that white has the advantage, but it means that that's one of his themes, and one you might want to think about if you're trying to figure out how to play against this variation. So here's how this game went here, and then f4. It's an interesting way to stop the attack that black's starting with g5. g5 is a little bit wild. Now f4 gives up the e4 square, but it really strengthens this square, and it looks like white might have a few more chances on the king's side than black does. At any rate, white has a little bit of a space advantage in the center, and black's bishop is still really bad. So I tend to like white here. Now, it's not over by any means, but I think white's got the better game here. So that was another game that was played. In this game, there was another order. Here's white won a game. A lower player won a game against Tomaszewski by playing that. Let me go back. By playing that line we were talking about with. Okay, so how did this go? Let me get this right. Knight f3, same position but different move order. E6, E3, bishop D6 here. So let me show you this game too. I thought this is just ways of thinking about playing for white. They're not very ambitious, but they're interesting. So here's another way you can play this. Same position, and again queen e7 to stop bishop a3, which black will usually try to do, because if white plays that move to enforce bishop a3, it tends to be that this kind of position is pretty decent for black, because he can stick a piece there if he needs to. So a4 is not a complete solution there. So white often plays this bishop b2 move and castles. And now he plays there thinking about playing bishop a3. So let's look at a bishop a3 game. Sorry, black's move here. Knight bd7. Now he plays bishop a3. I don't think that's the best move, but at least we'll get an illustration. I think knight e5 is a better move, as I just mentioned. But I think this is very interesting. White played here. Black could just play knight e4 also, but I think e5 is a good move. Now white could take this, maybe get just a slight advantage. Position like this, maybe it's just a little easier for white to play because this bishop is blocked off by its own pawn. But this certainly isn't much. It's not worth getting really worried about for black, but because black has, pretty active play and some space. But instead of that, white played, what did white do? Took, and then played knight takes, queen takes, here. And this is a lower player playing white against Tomaszewski. And the irritating thing is for black is that if he's the higher rated player trying to get chances, it's very hard to do anything in this kind of position because white's pieces are coming out so naturally. That doesn't mean white's better. It just means that it's pretty easy to play, and black's got to figure out some sort of strategy. Tomaszewski's a 2700 player, but he's having trouble getting active counterplay because everything's getting simplified. And in fact, he tried a little too hard and played this strange little move. I may have the move order wrong here, but I think this is right. White played g3. White's doing basically nothing. And strange to say, white actually had a sort of serious advantage here because of these little weak dark squares. The king's a little exposed, and he went on to win the game. I mean, this is only a small advantage, but there's just enough to do here for white that it's very irritating. So that was a big upset and shows you kind of how these dark square strategies can lead to a little something at any rate. Okay, so one more time now in the main game. I hope I'm not completely distracting everybody, but these are sort of anti-Dutch ideas for white. And in a way, this shows how much the stonewall structures are respected now, because if white has to play this way with these small advantages, well, that's not so bad for black, is it? Nevertheless, I think white does have ways to play. In this game, he played b3 again, and there's also a3, by the way. It was not a bad move, but I guess I won't get into that. There's a nice game white won with a3 and tried to provoke a5. Well, I won't go into that. It's going to get too complicated. Okay, now here you can again play queen e7, and then white can play this move. Knight e5, the one I was talking about. And the other idea white has is to play like this. And I wanted to show you this real quickly because it's another thematic idea for white. Looks like white runs out of ideas sometimes in these positions. But let me just show you this again. Knight on e5. That's a very, nice position, nice place to have that. And then now this is threatened twice. So he plays the move knight e2. Now that's a move that's really worth remembering. Now the obvious thing here is that you're ready to attack that knight without getting this knight exchanged, simplifying in black's favor. But the second thing is that this knight's very well placed here compared to either here or here. It can go to f4, it can be a really good square. Even g3 can be a good square. And you're threatening f3. So what happens in this game, for example? Yeah, he tried taking this and then playing bishop c5. And now knight d4. Another place the knight can go is that once this is captured, the knight can go to that very handy square. And pretty soon, white's just going to play f3. And black's still got that bad bishop. And that really is kind of bad. Sometimes that bishop can free itself on b7 followed by c5. And sometimes it can even sneak over here. But in both those ideas are kind of not applicable here. So that means that bishop probably is just a bad piece. And so let me see. This happened. And white just came up. And I won't show you the rest of the game, but you can kind of see that white's better. Maybe not by a ton, but he's got more space. Black has this pretty bad minor piece. And white's pieces are pretty flexible and active. So finally, back to this game. We have bishop a3, b6, right here, knight e4. And I think, again, this is a very handy move, just to play there. And then you can move this knight maybe here and play f3, or even move the knight back and play f3. It's just a handy square for the knight, a good thing to think about. He didn't play that. He played that way. And black didn't exchange, so you could play knight e2 again. Anyway, you get our basic position again. This time white exchanges off that knight and still hopes to have a small advantage. It's not much, but he's got more room on the queen side, and this is still a rather bad bishop. So the idea is unless black can get c5 in, which has some tactical problems, this bishop's going to remain bad, this bishop here. So I'm just trying to show a few ways for white to play against this system by using real-world examples. This is only slightly better. Now that's a good break because otherwise white's just going to build up on the queen side. You know, a4, a5, maybe a4, b5, and he has more space, and eventually he can just play there, and that bishop's going to be stuck. So black counterattacks in the center, good idea, and white plays that nice move knight e2 that I like so much. And black tries to attack on the king side. It's just he doesn't really have the firepower to do that. And black sacrifices a piece, well, doesn't sacrifice a piece, but he sort of temporarily sacrifices a piece. But if he just plays a move like this, he's kind of on the retreat, and this bishop still isn't very good. I don't know if I give a line there. Oh yeah, oh that's right, it doesn't really work because you have this nice move f4 attacking these two pieces, and when he checks to save his piece, he's a pawn ahead, but it just turns out that here he has a heck of a time getting out of the attack after rook comes over. This pawn is also hanging, and will be hanging again after one of these moves is made. Rook ae1 is the main idea. That's the real problem here. The queen is awkwardly placed, and that's still hanging. So that was the idea. Instead, black temporarily sacrifices a piece. But what that means is he's probably going to end up a pawn down. And that's indeed what happens. After check, one of the ideas is to play here and just allow black to check because you're going to have such a great counterattack. But instead, black decided to take the queens off. A good decision. But white was better because his minor piece, first of all, he's temporarily a pawn up. And secondly, his minor piece right here is much better than black's minor piece. This one here is better than that one because that's stuck defending that pawn, and even that's on a light square. So I could show you a few more moves, but white's considerably better here. Even rook takes gives you some advantage because of that passed pawn. But this is probably a better way to do it. So white brings his king into position. Now there's a problem with knight here, so black ends up giving up a pawn just to stop that. And now one of these pawns falls, and white ends up with the better game and ended up winning the game. So back to the chat. Hey, John Hartman, hi. Okay, now we know about Llewellyn already. People who've been on this show before know that we have that this is a Welsh name, Llewellyn. Llewellyn is also the guy in Shakespeare, right? Henry V. His name is Llewellyn. His advisor, great character, and the one who goes on and on about the laws of war, the rules of war, and violating the rules of war, and how disgraceful that is. So I'm sure that Alan knows about that. It means lake. I didn't know that. That's cool. Okay, folks, so that's Alan's last name, Llewellyn, and as I say, that's Henry V, one of the great Shakespeare plays, made popular by Kenneth Branagh's, well, first by Laurence Olivier, of course, in the old days. It has a classic Henry V movie, and Kenneth Branagh did a Henry V movie, which I think is just superbly done, and I don't think all of Branagh's work is that great, but I think that one is really something. Definitely recommended. And watch out for his advisor, Llewellyn. At least I think that's his name, isn't it? You might want to confirm that, Alan. If it isn't Llewellyn spelled exactly the same way, it's very, very similar. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it Glenauer? Maybe that's Glenauer. Oh, oh, I'm embarrassed. There is a Llewellyn in there, but maybe it's Glenauer that actually is the Welshman that makes all those statements. Oh, it's been too long. Okay, no more questions here, it looks like. No more chess questions. We're getting diverted here. Um, Carlsen is the best of all time. Norway chess. Have you seen Robert James Fischer have so bad results at tournaments? Absolutely. Fischer actually is very interesting because most of his career he wasn't really the best player in the world, was he? I mean, he was famous and he won all his U.S. championships, but he had negative records against all of the Soviets, against Tal and Petrosian and Spassky and all of them. He had negative records against, and he had tournaments. He tended to avoid tournaments with the Russians in after a while and played lower tournaments. So I would say his results. Well, first of all, he didn't play as much because he was always kind of either not playing for some reason or another. And a lot of the tournaments he played in, like those South American tournaments, were a lot weaker than the tournaments that people play in these days, or that the Russians were playing in at the time. Oh yeah, absolutely. Fischer, in a way, is of the great geniuses of chess, and he was a genius. Was in a sense, it took the longest time for him to really be whether he was the best player in the world or not, to have the best results, and especially to beat his peers. His peers, Geller had a tremendous record against Fischer. So if you look back, you'll see that Fischer was not. I would say Carlsen's career is much more impressive than Fischer's so far. Much, much, much more impressive. Also, he's been world champion more than just once. Fischer was only world champion once. And longevity and ability to win against various people is part of being an all-time great player. Just one of the great players. Of course, Fischer was one of the great players, but so whether he's better than the top 10 or something is to me unclear. Just because he didn't play long enough and his results really weren't as good. Now, if you want to talk about short term, there was that little period with the candidates where he beat the three players, none of which, by the way, were his main, the people who were the ones that were giving him the most trouble. And Petrosian was getting older and really didn't do that much after that either. But at any rate, that was an amazing, certainly as you pointed out later in the chat, winning 20 games against those guys in a row. Now that was really what? That was just the three candidates, and maybe that was just the first couple of games of the Petrosian match, and Taimanov and Larson, and the end of the interzonal, I think. But so for a short period, that streak could arguably be the best streak of all time. Actually, some of Steinitz's play and his match play was pretty astounding, but still, that's I don't like the sound of the anti-Dutch. Okay, let me go back and just see. How do you feel about the white setup you showed versus other Dutch variations like the classical? Maybe next F3. Yeah, that's in my book actually. I give quite a few lines like that in my D4 book my repertoire book, which I guess I'm allowed to mention. That's the repertoire. My own book, and I can't think of the title. My chess repertoire book, opening repertoire for white, chess opening repertoire for white, which is with D4. So that in that book I give. Now, of course, I give this too. I give this line. But I also have lines, for example, against this and this and this. I do a lot of talk about these kinds of positions. Even if whether black plays knight f6 or bishop b4, playing e3, bishop d3, often f3, and queen c2. I actually have a lot of material on that. And in fact, I don't just give knight c3 against f5. I also give c4. And in a lot of the c4 lines, I give the same idea, playing knight c3, e3, bishop d3, knight e2. I think it's underrated. One problem with playing this way is you have to be careful about your move orders because sometimes black will get this attack. He'll get this kingside attack that can be very irritating. For example, let me just show you some typical line, maybe queen c2 and castles in here or something. And one thing that sometimes happens to white is that black ends up playing, well, yeah, okay, this is good enough. Let's say he plays here, for example. And white plays here and black plays here and white plays here, you've got to be a little careful about the king side. Like, for example, if you castled now, I suspect that would be a sound sacrifice already. But it turns out that's not the only problem, even if you haven't castled yet. Like, let's say you castle here, and black just voluntarily brings the bishop back to d6 really soon. Maybe makes one other move first. I don't know, queen e1 or something. It's probably not a good move, but anyway. So this kind of position can be very difficult if you're not a strong player. Now, Korchnoi used to play this way anyway, and he would just play a couple moves, and all of a sudden he'd win in the center with maybe even a pawn sacrifice or something, and he'd win. He'd exploit this kind of position and win anyway. And I think you can do that. It's just that before you set up here, I would delay castling for one thing. I like to play bishop here. And then when you do castle and play f3, you bring your bishop back down to e1 and protect your king side that way, as well as get an active bishop here. But the answer is yes, I like this plan a lot. And you can play it against e3. You can also play it, now what are the other Dutches? The Stonewall. Yeah, you can play it against the Stonewall. Most people won't set up the Stonewall, I don't think, if you play that order. That's the only problem. In other words, once you've done this, you can no longer play e3 and bishop d3, right? So that's when they set up the Stonewall. Most players won't set up a Stonewall if you play here, and if you play, for example, this move. They might, I suppose, but see, it's a little difficult because this move allows taking, which is a little awkward. It's probably not the pawn structure that black wants, although maybe it is. Maybe it could be. So yeah, so you could get a Stonewall this way, I suppose. I tend to like white here. I think it is a good structure for white, but black could certainly play this way. It's not the end of the world. So yeah, great question. I think it's a good way to sort of get out of the main book lines too. Okay. Glindor, maybe. There's Llewellyn and there's somebody else. Oh, Glauer? No, I should know it, but I don't. Okay, is the Sozin attack goof? Oh, good. Against the Sicilian. How is the Fischer-Sozin attack? What is your opinion? You know, that's interesting too. When I was growing up, that's all I played as white was the Sozin attack. And also, it was just enormously popular. And now, when do we see the Sozin attack? And why is it that we don't see it more often? Well, okay, here's one maybe reason. Against this move, this is so popular that you're seeing fewer knight c6s in general. The Sozin attack in the knight c6 order would be something like this. It would be here instead of bishop g5. And then you get these big main lines. And the Velimirovich attack, which is the way that everybody pretty much played it after a while, goes like this, with queen e2 and castling queenside, and then throwing g4, g5. Now, a couple things about that. One is they tend to be very, very, very forcing lines that go on for a long time, these positions. And you know, you end up getting this kind of position, and there's all kinds of forcing lines where white's going like this and trying to mate, and black is playing over here with knight here and knight up and b5, and it's all very forcing. The thing about those positions is they got kind of worked out, and I think black was doing okay if he played exactly. So that was maybe one thing that happened to the Sozin, is that even the Velimirovich attack, which is really fun for white, got too specific and got too worked out. That's against knight c6. Now the problem with the Sozin in the Najdorf, I mean there's a lot of problems with the Sozin in the Najdorf, but one problem, a couple things. I used to play it against the Najdorf too, and I thought I knew a lot about it, but you know, who knows, relative to modern theory. In the Najdorf, there's a couple issues. Well, actually, I should also say, even in the Scheveningen, I should mention that. This is called the Scheveningen, and white, of course, can play the carries attack. But if he plays the Sozin, which is what I used to play, there are a couple issues here, but one of them is that black doesn't have to play a6. Black can play for knight a6. So, for example, or knight d7, c5. Even in the Najdorf, black can play this idea to get rid of that. That's what Kasparov played against, not this exact order, because you could play bishop e6 probably, but in principle, black can play for the move knight c5. There's also this move knight a6, which is a bit of a problem. Something like this, usually bishop here is played because he's got to watch out for knight here or d5. And then knight a6, followed by knight c5. And I had people play that against me. I think Ken Rogoff played something similar to this against me once. Don't remember for sure. And it's irritating because that's the bishop you really want to support your attack, either this attack or even generally the bishop exerts a lot of influence in all of the Sozin attacks, and black can get rid of it. So there's a lot of move order issues. Now, if you played against the Najdorf, the problem is a lot of the main lines don't seem to work very well in these positions. If you play, for example, I hope I didn't get this right. Bishop e7. Oh yeah, the f4, f5 lines. Black can usually counterattack and win this pawn, or do some other breakthrough kind of move before before you get what you want. For example, this line was played for a long time, but it turns out that black counterattacks by pinning this knight, and then plays knight here, and then white has to either sacrifice the pawn or play queen h5. And I played this. I remember I lost to a game against Brown with this. I don't think white's even equal here. Even though it looks really nice and there's all kinds of sacrificial ideas, like a rook f7 is an idea, bishop takes e6 is an idea. I had a game against Brown where I got the bishop takes e6 idea, and he just declined it and developed his pieces and had the better game. It was very frustrating. Also in this exact position, I think that's a pretty good move. And it's all been sort of worked out. It's a little too worked out. It's a little too forcing is the idea. And if you don't play e5, the problem is he ends up getting pressure on that pawn. It's just too hard to defend your center. So that's a superficial answer, but I think that's kind of what happened to the Sozin, is that in all the different variations of the Sozin, black has concrete ideas that are working pretty well. Now, to go back to that knight c6 line, it's true that people aren't playing knight c6 very much, but why are they playing the Rouser instead of the Sozin would be the question. Of course, black plays knight c6 with the idea of playing the Sveshnikov too, which is this move. But if they do play this way, most players are still playing, I think, bishop g5 here. You'll see that more often than you will bishop c4. This is called the Rouser attack. Why don't you see bishop c4? Well, like I say, there's these long-winded main lines of the Sozin. Now, the other way to get the Sozin is don't castle queenside. Don't play bishop e3 in here. And these lines have been known for years, these f4 ideas. You have to play bishop e3 at some point because there'll be a knight takes d5 idea. And these ideas with bishop e3 and f4 have been around for years and years and years. And you'll see these, wait, what happened there? Somehow my tempi sort of ended up wrong, I think. But this kind of thing with knight takes and bishop takes, how would that go, for example? Knight takes, bishop takes here, and white going like this, and black going like this. And these have been known for years, and I think a lot of those lines are considered dead equal. So those have been abandoned also, I think. You won't find too many games like this anymore either. So it's kind of sad, but I think just too much of the theory was worked out, and that's why you don't see the Sozin as much. Okay. But as I say, I loved it. I played it for years. Golyubov wrote a whole book about playing with the Sozin system, and he said he won, I don't know, 75 or 80% of his games in the old days with the white side of the Sozin. But that was many years ago, and I think that black's very well prepared for it now. You can also avoid the Sozin. A lot of people do that. It's a bit lazy, John, but because you don't really need to if you know all the lines, but I think it's very handy, and of course a lot of people do this just so they don't have to study it. What you do is you play, of course that's in the knight c6 line that you play. It's the main, you can play queen b6 in other positions, but the main reason you would play queen b6 would be in this exact position. That drives the knight away from the center. The idea is that if this happens, you're losing your pawn and you don't have enough compensation. So white usually moves there, and then black comes back again to c7 with the queen, and he's avoided these dynamic attacks where the knight's in the center and white goes blasting away. In fact, sometimes white returns to the center in these positions. White actually ends up playing, I don't know, let's go like this. Queen goes there, that's the idea. And white will actually bring the knight back into the center later. But whose move is it here? I don't know, white's move. I guess f4 is a good possibility. And black castles because there's no good discovered attack this way. Oh, black might play a6 first. I'm not sure. Might play a6 first. So you get this kind of position. And I don't know what the theory on this sort of thing is anymore. I think black still plays this way fairly often. So black must be pretty close to equality, if not equal. So yeah, that's a way to just avoid the Sozin. And good point, John. what else is going on here? Is the Grand Prix attack refuted? No, I don't think it's refuted at all, but there's plenty of good lines against it. I've noticed that the main lines of the Grand Prix, the one that lead, the old bishop c4 lines, which lead to the position we just looked at with the reverse colors, the Fischer line, you'll recognize this in a second. If you look at these f5 ideas here, this is actually considered already maybe better for black. And now, I don't know if you remember, we just had this position with reverse colors where black tried to play f4 in the same position. So that shows you how Fischer's line is really quite unsound. You can also try to make this move one move later, but of course if you do, you have to run into the d5 lines. These lines have been looking pretty mediocre for white at best. You have to really know. I think it's hard to even equalize for white. So I would say these lines just aren't working. So what white has done is he switched to bishop b5. I think most top players that play the Grand Prix play that line. And it's doing also maybe not that great. The main line always used to be just going here, attacking this bishop. And then white had all kinds of ideas of just leaving the bishop hanging there by castling, or coming back, or taking. Taking was the original idea, playing this position. But black has a lot of good solutions in this position, and I don't think anybody thinks white's better here anymore. So once again, I think things just got kind of worked out in the Grand Prix, and white. Now that's fine when things are worked out, but what you want at the end of your analysis is something. Okay, maybe black's equalized, but there's interesting chances for both sides. And I think most people decided as white that this wasn't very interesting. That most of these lines weren't that interesting. And for a while, white played this early bishop b5. He played this move. Well, actually, they played it even now. this move was kind of interesting. And you could also play it, I think, one move later, after there. I believe you can also play it here. The idea is to bring the bishop back to attack this way. But anyway, and it was played. It was also played in this position a bunch for a while. All these things have been looked at a lot. People who play the Sicilian just don't seem to be afraid of any of these lines. But there are ways of getting out of at least the main line. At least you don't have to memorize all this stuff. You don't have to memorize all this main line stuff. That's the idea. And there are other ways to get out of the main lines of the. You can play the closed Sicilian, for example. Just play like that. There are other ways to get out of the main lines of the Sicilian. There's also the Alpen. I mean, it's still around, and people still play it, and it's a nice weapon to have against the Sicilian. And that's what you're trying to do. There's things like b3. You can play around with that stuff, or you can wait one move with b3 depending what he does, and then play b3 next. They're all playable. None of them give white an advantage against good play, the best play, but they don't give you a disadvantage either, most of them. Oh yes, and there's the Kopek. The Kopek is played. I don't know why nobody plays the Kopek. The Kopek is to play this either right now or after the move c3. They're played, I think, in both orders. But the idea is, for example, to play this move right now. And white wants to castle, play bishop back, and then play d4. And it also hasn't. It's suffered theoretically a little bit. It should be fun. Absolutely should be fun. And I recommend playing this stuff. Why not? You can play it for a while. If you find all of your opponents know specific lines that irritate you, well, then you can give it up, right? I remember against this line, one thing that irritated me was the idea of playing d5 a move later, even though you've already played d6. So for example, something like this. Now often white plays h3. In fact, I think white usually plays h3 because they don't like these lines with bishop g4. That's the main line of the Kopek, I think, is to play a3. And then one thing that used to irritate me is that I think this move, a whole tempo down, is still a problem, just attacking there. Because if white takes, black can probably take either way. You know, here with an indirect attack down the file and the idea knight f4 and all of that, or queen takes with tempo on that bishop and good centralization. So what white has to do is either defend that, which isn't possible, or go by. And then I think there was a whole bunch of theory here that indicated that black's doing pretty well. I mean, white can do fancy things here, like e6. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this exact position you can play e6. But as I recall, this kind of thing falls short. And I don't remember why. I think just back again, protecting that. Yeah, none of white's usual tricks are going to work here, are they? You know, getting something on this file is too slow. This little idea here is just, you know, a self pin. This is really not going to work, I don't think. Black's got much control over the center. Now, I don't know exactly how to play this for black, but I'd be very scared here as white. I don't like, you know, even if you get unpinned, you know, he's got all these center pawns and he's ahead in development. So even though the king's moved, I think black's better there. So if that's true, then you've got to figure out some other way of protecting this. So that probably involves queen e2 and maybe bishop b5, for example, something like this. But I just don't believe it. It's a nice French defense for black. It's just, I think. You know, you have to prove this. I'm not sure. Maybe white could get away with this, but it's not much fun. So that particular order I remember frustrated me as white when I was trying to recommend playing this way for my students, and also I was trying to think about what they should do as black. I think it's interesting you can play d6 and then d5. So maybe white should castle, but then I think people were all worried about this move. I think that gave, and then if you retreat again, you know, there might be this move anyway. In which case you probably have to just defend this. Or something like that. And then black's very comfortable in a position like this. I don't know the theory exactly, but that might give you a start. Then Colin asks, oh, does the Queen's Indian reverse? Let me see, first of all, what else I prepared here that I should do. Well, how are we doing for time? We're probably really late, aren't we? Oh my God, we're really late, folks. So I will get to your other questions, Colin, and also some other stuff, some games. I swear I'm going to show some games. I've got one by Alan and a couple others that people have sent me. And next week I'm going to dedicate at least to time to show a couple of games. I'm not going to answer Colin's question about the Queen's Indian because I'll get addicted, and it's already well past the time we usually are supposed to stop. So I'll just stop here. Remember, askimwatson@chessclub.com. I get my most interesting questions by email, askimwatson@chessclub.com. That's chessclub.com. Please send me your questions. And you can also send them to John L. Watson on ICC, message John L. Watson. And I will see everybody next week. Thank you so much for coming on. Please come on again. And I want to thank you for being patient and listening to all of this. Thank you.